Hi everyone, I'm Meghan Sullivan, and welcome to History in Games, a podcast where I play historical fiction games and talk about the real history behind the game. In today's episode, we're going to be breathlessly talking about the legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, which is full of rich history, specifically ancient Japanese history. Now don't worry, there are no spoilers for the game, so if you haven't played it yet, you can listen to this episode worry-free. Also, please go play Breath of the Wild. It's a fantastic game. And no, I'm not sponsored by Nintendo. This is History in Games. Okay, so The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. It is one of my absolute favorite games of 2017, which was a banner year for games, by the way, and one of my absolute favorite Zelda games of all time. And I've been playing this series since 1988, so that tells you something. Breath of the Wild's cel-shaded world is not only gorgeous to look at, its oddly shaped buildings and ancient technology aren't like anything we've ever seen in a Zelda game, which gives it a fantastic sense of wonder and mystery. And as it turns out, that is not an accident. Almost everything you see in the game, from divine beasts to shrines to elaborate facial tattoos, can be tied to real Japanese history. And when you know that, you have an all-new appreciation for the game. So, if you're a Zelda fan, this podcast is going to be a lot of fun for you. And if you love history, it's going to be a lot of fun for you. And if you love both, boy, is this going to be a lot of fun for you. So, let's hop back into the Animus. Yes, I know, the Animus is an Assassin's Creed construct, but whatever. And travel back in time 5,000 years to ancient Japan, when we'll learn more about the prehistoric Jomon people, why they had such cool tattoos, why they had such cool sunglasses, how they made such cool pottery, why they lived partially submerged in the earth, and how Link in Zelda's world is connected to it all. As we travel back in time, I just want to let people know that although I have studied the Japanese language for about 2 decades, my accent is still not very good, so I apologize in advance if my pronunciation is terrible. Also, if you're a Zelda fan or a fan of Japanese history, I want to hear from you. Tell me your favorite Zelda game or your favorite moment from Breath of the Wild. Tell me about your favorite part of this podcast, something you learned that you never knew before. Email me at meghanhistory, meghanhistory@gmail.com and let me know, and I'll share your answers on the next episode. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the show. And here we are in northern Honshu, Japan. It's 2500 BCE, and we're about to meet a prehistoric people known as a Jomon. If we look around, we can see a sunny clearing near a river, ringed by sunken thatched huts. And around this river, a peaceful group of people no older than their 30s or 40s, wearing jade necklaces, bone hairpieces, and clothes made of animal skins and mulberry bark, are busy going about their daily lives. Some are fishing for salmon in the nearby river, others are baking cookies made of acorns and yam paste or animal fat. One group is taking their bows and arrows into the nearby forest to do some deer and bear hunting, while the rest are shaping clay into small figurines or elaborately shaped pottery. The Jomon people have a somewhat darkish complexion, thick black hair, and a smattering of freckles. They're also covered in red tattoos and body paint. When they smile, you'll notice that some of them have had their teeth knocked out. They don't have any iron tools, and though they're familiar with horses, they don't really use them. They also don't have a writing system, so it's hard to decipher their language, but it probably wouldn't be recognizable to modern Japanese. Who are they? Are we in the right place and time? What does the Jomon period have to do with the legend of Zelda? Well, let's start with the latter question. In a promotional video by Nintendo published March 14, 2017, Breath of the Wild art director Takizawa Satoru explains that the Jomon period is the inspiration for much of the art style in Breath of the Wild. Here's a quote from the video. The Jomon period in Japanese history was the inspiration for the Shake-a-Slate, shrines, and all the other ancient objects and structures in the game. We ended up taking the Jomon aesthetic and using it as a base to expand upon the game's ancient Sheikah civilization. The reason was because the Jomon period is relatively unknown to much of the world. It has a nuance and mystery that we found really appealing. We were looking for something that would feel unique, and settled on Japan's Jomon period as a result. And thus, the Jomon period is definitely linked to, well, Link. And as we'll later see, it's not just structures and objects that are connected to prehistory. There are also features in the game that, although may not be directly inspired by Jomon culture, wouldn't be out of place in it. So, with that said, what is the Jomon period? The Jomon period, or Jomon Jidai in Japanese, is set in Japanese prehistory and is traditionally dated between 14,000 and 300 BCE, although I should note that recently some scholars have pushed the end date back to about 1000 BCE. Anyway, the name Jomon means rope or cord marked. The term was coined by an American scholar named Edward S. Morse, who, while excavating in the area around Yokohama in 1877, came across distinct pottery featuring elaborate designs made by pressing braided twine or grass into the surface of wet clay. This artistic technique was used for over 10,000 years, thus marking and naming the Jomon period. Now, Takezawa-san doesn't mention which part of the Jomon period Breath of the Wild is inspired by, which is a bit confusing because we're dealing with nearly 14,000 years of history divided into 6 phases: incipient, initial, early, middle, late, and final Jomon. But it's likely we're dealing with a time frame somewhere between the mid to late Jomon period, about 2500 to 1000 BCE, where the most distinct and beautiful prehistoric objects like flame pottery and dogu statues really start to take form. And if you play Breath of the Wild, you can clearly see mid to late Jomon influence just about everywhere. Now, for those of you who have played Breath of the Wild, I know what you might be thinking. What Jomon influence where? There doesn't seem to be anything prehistoric about this game. I mean, there are villages in the game that look like something out of medieval Europe, and a lot of the characters have hairstyles and costumes that look more reminiscent of, say, Japan's Kofun period, or even Warring States period. They certainly don't look like anything a caveman would wear, and that's true. But if you know what to look for, you can start to see just how much of the Jomon culture is snuck into the game. And I think the best place to start a historical Easter egg hunt is with one of the most ubiquitous objects you'll find in the game: shrines. Shrines, for those who haven't played the game, are like little mini dungeons where you have to solve puzzles or undergo trials. There are about 120 shrines scattered throughout Hyrule, and the only way to find them is to either go out and explore or complete special quests. Now, although every shrine has its own name, its own trial, and its own treasure, they all look alike on the outside, which is good because it makes them easier to find. Well, that, and at the start of the game, you're given a device called a Shake-a-Slate, which pings you whenever you're near a shrine, so, that also helps. So what do shrines look like? Well, shrines look like an upside-down flower pot. They have a narrow cylinder top and a wide domed bottom. Every shrine is decorated with beautiful swirling patterns that glow orange and blue, and the interior is always built underground. These details are important because they indicate shrines are possibly based on one of 2 different historical relics from the Jomon period. The first is related to prehistoric architecture. The people of the Jomon period lived in what are called pit houses or pit dwellings. These pit dwellings started off as simple conical-shaped huts made of thatch and wood, with dirt floors sunk deep into the earth in order to take advantage of the earth's natural warmth during cold winters. The interior of a pit dwelling was around 3 meters or more in diameter. It featured a central hearth and enough room to store food, pottery, and tools. It was a pretty spacious home and could accommodate anywhere between 5 to 10 people. Later, these conical pit dwellings would evolve and include additions like multiple wooden poles that could hold up a more square-shaped hut and a grass rooftop meant to keep the home extra dry during the rainy season. And starting in the late Jomon period, some buildings were even elevated off the ground on stilt-like structures, with ladders or steep stairs leading up to the entrance. By the way, if you play Breath of the Wild, you can see an echo of these elevated types of buildings by going to places like Kakariko Village. But whether they were elevated off the ground or buried in the ground, the conical shape of Jomon architecture never really disappeared and remained throughout the era. And you can see that rotunda-like form in every shrine in Hyrule. Shrines even function like early Jomon houses. You have to go down into the ground in order to access the inside of the shrine. And once you're inside, you'll notice the floors are made of stone, not earth. Interestingly, some Jomon pit dwellings did feature flagstone floors, which makes the similarities between Breath of the Wild shrines and Jomon pit dwellings even more acute. Of course, I have to note that the inside of these shrines also feature a lot of futuristic technology, which isn't exactly historically accurate. But I like how the Sheikah relics found in the game represent a long-lost civilization, and that's kind of what the Jomon period is. But there might be a far more simple and straightforward explanation for why Breath of the Wild shrines look the way they do. I mentioned earlier these shrines look like upside-down pots, right? And that's because they might actually be based on what the Jomon period is best known for. It's rare and exquisite pottery.